Greetings, man-things, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Let's take a little bit of a peek at the Children of the Horned Rat, shall we?
The 4th edition of Warhammer Age of Sigmar is upon us. Feels like just yesterday that the game was launched. It wasn't, it was 9 years ago. You're just getting older. Sorry. Still, this new edition centres the Skaven as the antagonist to the Stormcast for the box set, and since we've always kind of liked Skaven despite everything about them being horrible, we never really learned much about them from beyond what we picked up playing Vermintide. So we thought we'd do the sensible thing and learn all about them by diving into their first dedicated rulebook from 1993. And dragging you all along with us, of course.
As is tradition. Giant rats have been in Warhammer since the very beginning in 1983, although they were just that, giant rats. Once 2nd edition rolled around, the giant rats would show up again, but their giant size was linked to the corrupting powers of chaos. In 1986 we have the proper introduction of the Skaven, giant chaos-mutated bipedal rats, showing up both in a nice big article in the Citadel Journal and in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. The former article also lets us know that the Skaven were a creation of Jez Goodwin, if you were curious. It's hard not to see a direct through line between these 3 incarnations of giant rats, from Big Rodent to Big Chaos Rodent to Big Chaos Rodent who has stood up and is calling you a slur. A neat through line, only mildly undone by the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay book and the 3rd edition main rulebook from 1987, having both Skaven and giant chaos mutated rats completely unrelated to Skaven at the same time. In a feat of needless redundancy, the giant rats even sometimes took on human-like qualities, although the giant rats are chill with the Skaven, so that's nice.
Putting all that aside though, the first solo rulebook they'd get was 1993's Warhammer Armies Skaven for Warhammer Fantasy Battle 4th edition. It was written by Andy Chambers and just so happens to be what we're looking at today. Also, it was sent to us by George, so thank you very much, George. And right away, this cover-up by David Gallagher is fantastic. Gallagher would go on to produce more technically impressive works later, sure, but there's something really appealing about the bold use of colours in this era. Plus there's so many fun little guys to look at. This one's my favourite. The book is formatted in the same basic way as any other GW book of this era, so we start off with about 20 pages of fluff before we get to anything resembling rules. It begins by letting you know that the origins of the Skaven are shrouded in mystery. Some folks don't even believe they exist. Wait, that's a Princess Bride reference, isn't it? An old Chilean tale, the Doom of Kavzar, may hold the answer to their origins. To make a short story even shorter, long ago a city was prosperous. They decided to build a big tower to honour the gods. After several generations they were still building it and work had slowed to a crawl. Some dude shows up and says, "Oh yeah, I can finish the tower on my own, I just can't do it while you're looking at me." And the city folks say, "Fill your boots, mate." And then a mysterious bell appears on top of the tower, it rings 13 times, and the land becomes blighted and full of rats. Rats that keep getting bigger and bigger until, eventually, Skaven.
This explains Skaven Blight, a place with a large twisted tower in the centre of somewhere known as the Blighted Marshes, which happens to be populated by giant bipedal rats. From there, thousands of miles of tunnels reach out across the old world and beyond. Then we get a glimpse of Skaven society, first looking at the different clans, such as the Beastmasters of Clan Moulder, the Assassins of Clan Eshin, the Warlock Engineers of Clan Scryer, and the Plague Monks of Clan Pestilence. These, and more, are ruled over by the 13 Lords of Decay, of whom there are technically only 12, who coordinate the Skaven in accordance with the Great Horned Rat's will, or at least their interpretation of it. They sit at the top of a highly hierarchical structure, where everyone from individual Skaven to whole clans are always squabbling and fighting to try and improve their standing, with the occasional assassination for good measure. After all, the section opens with the quote, "Skaven society is a tyranny moderated by assassination." They also really like Warpstone, which is effectively like solidified chaos. Snipe thinks that Warpstone looks delicious. I do not. Please let us know in the comments your opinions on Warpstone's relative deliciousness and potential flavour so that you can help settle this very real marital dispute. Anyway, if you can think of a way Warpstone could be used, the Skaven already do it, as well as 5 other ways that you never even thought of. Doing weird stuff with Warpstone seems to be their favourite thing in the whole world, right above enslaving people. Especially enslaving other Skaven. After that, there's a lot of stuff about their wars, assassinations, infighting, plagues, you know, Skaven stuff. Also, big 2020 vibes from in 1115 Boris Goldgather, the much hated and incompetent emperor of the time, succumbed to the plague himself and the hard-pressed citizens of the empire finally had something to celebrate. This book was released in 1993, so that's a rare case of retroactive satire. Oh, and by the way, the Skaven's trademark speech pattern, you know, the whole "Die, die, dwarf men" thing, that's already in here, so that's neat.
There's also bits talking about their biology and temperament, which lets us know some fun things about the Skaven. Like that they're kind of impulsive, they're short-lived, and their metabolism burns at such a rate that them eating you after beating you in battle is honestly just something they kind of need to do to replenish their energy. We also learn less fun things, like female Skaven are lazy, semi-intelligent creatures who are traded as objects. Cool. In the back of the book there's a 5-page bit of fiction that we feel does a really good job of summing up general Skavenness. It's from the perspective of Grey Seer Thanquol, we'll get back to him later, as he goes to speak to the Council of 13. He's thinking about all the things that have gone wrong during his campaign, and how it wasn't his fault so many Skaven died because he didn't really think that far ahead. Plus, rat ogres are just unlucky. Once he meets the council and begins to wheezily apologise, they congratulate him for killing those Skaven who were definitely going to rebel, and will reward him with a rat ogre bodyguard. Thanquol is more than happy to take the credit. I mean, they were killed because of his orders, so was it not true, in a sense? Plus, he always thought rat ogres were lucky anyway.
Now, correct us if we're wrong, our familiarity with the faction was very surface level before reading this book, but it kind of feels like the Skaven didn't really change all that much before the end times hit.
It kind of feels like the Skaven were just the Skaven from pretty much day one.
On to the actual army list. We'll start with a refresher since we don't know if you've seen one of these videos before, or indeed seen a book from this era before. The way armies at this time were organised was that each type of unit was allocated a specific percentage of your total points. So in the Skaven's case, they could take up to 50% of their army in characters, required at least 25% of them to be from regiments, whilst also being able to take up to 25% in war machines, monsters and allies respectively. 40k fans may recognise this system from 2nd edition 40k, which makes sense since the systems shared a lot of things, although it must be said that unlike 2nd edition 40k, Warhammer 4th edition has a melee system that doesn't feel like it was transplanted in there from a completely different game. Anyway, to fill in your possibly half an army of characters, your choices were the mandatory Skaven Warlord General, a Battle Standard Bearer, Chieftains, Plague Priests, Vermin Lords, Warlocks and Grey Seers, and Champions for your individual regiments. These could all take magic items, which we'll get into later. And a few could ride mounts selected from the Monsters section, so if you wanted a big rat to ride a big spider, you could. And the Seers could ride around on a Screaming Bell, which we'll also get to later.
Your mandatory regiments could include one unit of the elite Storm Vermin, Clan Rat Warriors, a single unit of Gutter Runners, Assassins, Skaven Slaves, Plague Censer Bearers, Plague Monks, Pack Masters, with their accompanying Giant Rats and Rat Ogres, and finally, Globadiers. One of the more fun Skaven unit names to say out loud. Globadier. Their war machines were Warpfire Thrower teams, Doom Wheels, Giselle teams, and those Screaming Bells the Seers could ride around on. For monsters, like the other factions in the game, they got access to a bunch of generic big beasties and swarms. Although they got their rat swarms cheaper than other armies, for reasons I hope were obvious. And for their allies, they could pick units from the Undead, Chaos, Orcs and Goblins, and Dark Elves lists to add variety to the army, or at the very least, maybe give you a bit of a break from painting quite so much fur. These Skaven units had their own share of special rules, occasionally requiring several pages to explain, as was the style at the time. For example, we have the Screaming Bell, a huge magical bell that has all manner of magical effects.
When the striker is prodded into action, he swings the hammer, with a mighty blow strikes the master bell. A shower of fat green sparks explodes from the warpstone as he does so, and the master bell sounds with a deafening bass note which rolls like thunder. Bong!
The Screaming Bell, much like a regular bell, could not move under its own power, and so had to be placed inside an infantry unit of at least 10 Skaven who would push and drag the massive construct into battle. When you struck the bell for the first time, you'd roll a 1d6 on this table, the second time 2d6, the third time a 3d6, and so on. A sufficiently strong enemy attack could also cause a roll.
As you'd imagine, the effects of the bell got progressively more and more extreme, starting with small things like giving extra d6 movement to the unit it's attached to, or causing nearby cavalry to take a panic test. As the ring got louder, it began to be able to damage nearby war machines, walls and buildings, as well as send Skaven troops into a frenzied state. Finally, the bell became able to inspire fear, do massive damage to structures, and once you rolled high enough, self-destruct, hitting everything within 3d6 of the model with an automatic strength 3 hit as their eardrums burst.
With a final apocalyptic crack, the great bell splits in two, crashing to the ground with a sound like 10,000 thunderclaps rolled into one. Bong!
There's a building inevitability of destruction to this version of the Screaming Bell's rules that I just can't help but like a lot more than the current AOS or Old World versions. It's this kind of thing that, were I to have read it in 1993, would have made me go, well, that's it, I've got to collect a Skaven army now. Speaking of war machines, we also have the Doom Wheel, whose warp lightning weapon struck out at whatever units were close enough, friend or foe, with its 3 random range, random strength bolts. When hitting a unit, the bolt would be attracted to the model with the best armor save, since they were the ones wearing the most metal. I know that's not necessarily going to make sense, because I don't think that every instance of an armor save in 4th edition Warhammer was provided by metal. Probably. I don't have time to check every book, so let's just roll with it. Also, the Doom Wheel's random discharges of warp energy made casting spells around it a nightmare, as it could dispel them purely by being nearby. And this is not super important, but did you know there was a Doom Wheel themed endless runner game for mobile devices? We didn't. The ad for it has stop motion made with Warhammer minis. You can't play the game anymore. It's gone.
The assassins of Clan Eshin were able to hide in your regular infantry regiments, only to be revealed to your opponent the moment the unit ended up in close combat, at which point the mini would actually be placed on the table and the assassin could get to work with its weeping blades. Which reminds me of how the Calidus assassins worked in their 2nd edition Codex, now that I'm thinking about it. And Plague Censer Bearers fought alongside, but not actually in Plague Monk units, and emitted a 1-inch fog of death that could wound any model. This included the Plague Monks. And themselves. The basic war gear you'd equip your characters with was pretty unremarkable, but this was all because the fancy stuff was in the magic items. Characters in Warhammer at the time could pick from a selection of generic magic items, but as other books did, this book included several specifically for the faction in question. These were things like the Fellblade, not to be confused with a Fellblade, an astonishingly powerful sword meant to kill Nagash, and considering he's still around you can see how well that stuck. There's also Warpstone armor that strikes back at any enemy who attacks the wearer. There's Scalm, a tar-like substance that painfully mutates the skin around an injury as a one-use heal, and is again a fun thing to say. Scalm. Or is it Scarm? Like Barm? Oh, I just got that! Plus, there was, of course, the Ball That Sucks. And when you start looking at the points cost of some of these things, and that's something like a Grey Seer can have up to 4 of them, and ride a Screaming Bell, You start to understand why the characters were allowed to take up to 50% of your total points. It was a time of Hero Hammer after all.
Then there were the special named characters, the first of which being Grey Seer Thanquol and his Rat Ogre bodyguard, Bone Ripper. Unlike the version used in AOS, these characters were played as two separate minis, and Bone Ripper wasn't quite as the size of a house as he is today. Then we have Lord Skrolk, Plague Lord of Clan Pestilence. Again, has a fun name, there's just a lot of that in here, okay? Skrolk's a gross little guy with rotted, ragged skin hanging off him. If you used him as your warlord, you needed to take some plague monks, which seems fair. He also had to take some specific magic items which took his base price up to 400 points. One of which was the Rod of Corruption, which could instantly kill enemies and has a particularly fun bit of flavour text. They instantly collapse into a festering pile of rotted flesh and excrement. Quite dead. Then we have Ikit Claw, Chief Warlock of Clan Scryer. He went out of his way to learn the magics of other races, and so is able to use spells not normally available to the Skaven. He also burnt himself so badly in an experiment that he had to make himself a rad mechanical arm and mask. Oh, and he also invented the Doom Wheel, canonically, which is also rad.
Throt the Unclean was a special packmaster who was born with an extra arm, which he uses to provide extra stabbings. Deathmaster Snikch, Chief Assassin of Clan Eshin, is, well, the Chief Assassin of Clan Eshin, and as well as having a name that sounds like the onomatopoeia for Wolverine's claws being popped, he can also wield 3 weapons, but this time it's one in each hand and one in his tail, which is adorable. And finally, we have Warlord Queek Headtaker, a short-tempered rat with a massive ego. He has a trophy rack of heads, and at least one pair of hands, from his most memorable fights. And the way his particular hatred rule is described is, again, just great.
Warlord Queek is quick to anger, and develops a deeply psychotic hatred of anyone and anything that stands in his way. Dwarfs, orcs, and goblins stand in his way a lot, so he hates them all.
Now, most of these guys aren't in Age of Sigmar, but if you want to play with them, then you can always boot up Warhammer Total War 2, since you'll find most of them in there. Moving on to the colour section of the book, and it's really neat to see what is nowadays a pretty gritty and grimy army painted in the more vibrant house style of the time. In particular, it's interesting to see how the unifying green of Warpstone, present in many modern Skaven armies, is just absent. Not just because it wasn't modelled on the stuff in the same prominent way that it is now, but also because there's not really a single colour associated with it. Warpstone is said to glow black, poisonous gas created from it is supposed to be yellow-green, and the lightning the Doomwheel spits is purple. Now don't get me wrong, there is still a lot of green in there, but it's like green and not green. You know what I mean.
Although mostly what the colour section does is what all colour sections in old rulebooks do. Make me feel nostalgia for an era I wasn't around for, and make me kinda wanna collect an old Skaven army. Even though I'll probably never play a game with it. I should be allowed a few little rat men. As a treat. On the other hand, I think this book does illustrate a particular foible with the studio painting style at the time. When every faction is fairly colourful, nearly all featuring bold primary colours, the big battle shots can get a bit muddy, and it's not immediately apparent which unit belongs to which side unless you're already familiar with the models. You can tell which belongs to which army mostly by which way they're pointing. It's not something we've ever found to be a problem when viewing these things in real life, but when you view them in photography with their unified green bases on the big flat green backgrounds, it can just sometimes be a little visually difficult to take in. It's a similar effect, but at the other end of the spectrum, of when you see 2 Space Marine players play against each other and neither of them have got around to painting their miniatures yet. The differences between a Blood Angel and a Space Wolf are a little harder to take in when you're 4 feet away and everything is bare grey plastic.
The back end of the book is taken up with tactics, advice, and advertising some finely detailed Citadel miniatures that you can maybe buy please and thank you. In the tactics part, Andy Chambers, who is, yes, fully into his Lemmy phase, first goes into the weaknesses of the Skaven. Their low leadership, their lack of missile troops, and their lack of cavalry. These could all be mitigated somewhat. They had a rule where their leadership improved the more of them there were in a squad, for example, but it's always good to know the things to look out for before you start collecting an army. The rest gets into the nitty-gritty of army building. You know, what builds of units work well and how best to utilise them. Ultimately, the basic tactic is to just charge your opponent with an unreasonable amount of rats as quickly as possible, while backed up with their unreliable war machines. I'm starting to understand why I've seen people suggest that Skaven are more 40k orcs than fantasy orcs have ever been.
This advice leads into a section that shows you a small starter army and all the minis you'd have to buy to get it, which, as a collector of old minis myself, I really appreciate, as quite often the actual way you'd purchase a squad from brand new can be a little obfuscated by time, since the minis haven't been sold for years and they often don't show up on eBay in the quantities they were originally sold in. But here it just straight up says, to make a squad of Plague Monks you need 3 standard blister packs and a command blister. Puts things nicely in context. I don't blame you if you don't find that interesting, but I do. This section wraps up by giving you some tips on expanding the army as well as how to make a themed army. Want to go full Clan Pestilence? Then take more Plague Monks. It's all pretty obvious, but I suppose it's useful to actually say it for the newer players who may feel that everything previously talked about was pushing them down a particular build path. And with that we reach the end of our dive into the first Skaven book, and indeed our first dive into the Skaven that went beyond look at the funny rat men.
And what do we think of it? Well, like all Games Workshop army books of this time period, there's a lot here, both rules and fluff. Over the years stuff has changed for the Skaven, especially once Age of Sigmar hit, but not as much as we expected. They've pretty much always been the same loathsome rat men who are individually quite unpleasant, selfish, and short-sighted, but are also oddly endearing on account of being such little rat bastards. Plus there's something kind of fun about how they could have been a regular part of the Chaos Forces, just another kind of beastman I guess, but then they were all like, F you, we're doing our own thing, which would be very charming if it weren't for all the slavery.
So it's been fun to see this early version of them and see how it's informed the new stuff coming out for AOS 4th edition, as well as actually learn what they're like beyond, well, look at the funny rat men. And who knows, maybe if we do enough videos on these old Warhammer fantasy books, we'll get familiar enough with the whole thing that we don't feel the need to keep pointing out that we're not as familiar with the setting, so people don't get mad at us for not knowing what we're talking about. But until such time arises, thank you very much for watching.
And may your screaming bell rolls be forever under an 18.
Hello there. Looks like we actually put out a video that was vaguely relevant to what's going on with Warhammer currently. Aren't you proud of us? You can show that pride by leaving us a comment, giving us a like, or if you haven't already, subbing to the channel. This is the 60th episode of this series, so there's plenty more to watch if you're new. If you'd like to see these videos a little early and get your name in the credits like these fine folks here, then you can by supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. That support is what allows these videos to happen, so it is very much appreciated. See you next time.